Welcome back to Tiny Grimes Games, and I'm here with another Star Wars Destiny video. And today, I'm going to go ahead and rank the rares, essentially making a tier list. I did this for the legendaries already. If you want to go ahead and check that out, I'll put a link below. And this doesn't include the starter cards. It includes starter deck cards that are classified as rares, but it doesn't just include other starter deck cards like Force Throw. Alright, so to me, there's really three cards that I put in like the God tier. These cards are going to be worth money. Holocron, the Sith Holocron is probably actually in its own tier. I think that's actually a tier above the Super God tier. This card is going to be worth more than, I'm going to say most legendaries. Not all the legendaries at all, but a lot of them. It's even undervalued right now. I think it sells for like 15. I think it'll probably retain that value as most of the legendaries drop below that. This card is just phenomenal. I've talked about it at length in many videos. If you want to know more details as to why the Holocron is busted and reading the card doesn't do that for you, please check out several other sources. It is awesome. Lets you cheat cards into play, basically ramp for free. A card that is also in this God tier that is going to only go up in value is Datapad. People really undervalue this when it first came out. It does so much. Any deck that's not trying to blitz you down, resources are a good thing. But it's not just that. It's being able to fix your dice. Repeatable dice fixing in this game is incredibly powerful. And now that we know you can chain specials together, and what I mean by that is if you turn something to a special with a Datapad, you can say, oh, I'm going to resolve this one as well because I am resolving all of my specials right now. That becomes just insanely powerful and sets up all kinds of great combinations. So Datapad, on the one hand, gives you money. On the other hand, fixes your dice. It's an incredibly great card. You're going to want 2 in most of your decks. I have 4. I'm pretty happy with that. But it's a great card. You're going to want it. Holdout Blaster is not quite as strong as something like Sith Holocron, but because it is neutral and because it has blasters and is solid and is only 2, it pretty much goes in every single deck ever made that is a ranged attack type of deck, which is a lot of decks. A Han Rey kind of deck, Jango Veers, any deck with Jango, Politic, anyone you can think of, because it has redeploy, it makes it just this amazing gun and never goes away. Once it hits the table, it stays in play. So because of that, it's a card everyone wants 2 of for good reason. It is super, super strong. Don't get rid of your holdout blasters. Don't trade your holdout blaster for a force protection or something. That's a terrible deal. This is going to trade for legendaries. I'm just telling you now, this is going to be worth more than several legendaries. Not as much as Holocron, because Holocron has the potential to be completely busted, and you have to run 2 in every blue deck. But you're going to feel like, with Holdout Blaster, you have to run 2 in every deck. Like, it may be even in more decks than Holocron. Like, I'll have sometimes melee decks, and I'll be like, you know what could be good? A Holdout Blaster. It's just damage. It's a really good card. So these 3 are just bonkers. Another really great card that probably could have gone in that last tier, except for the fact that it's yellow only, so it's a little bit restrictive, is Jetpack. Jetpack is crazy. Jetpack is really the card, in my opinion, that makes the Han Rey deck so strong. Yes, the other blasters are great, but the fact that it's modified damage, which is usually a negative, ends up being a huge positive if you want to have a fast turn to be able to trigger Graveyard, the Starship Graveyard Battlefield. If you want to be able to do things like string together dice to kill Dooku so he can't discard to prevent them. The modified damage on Jetpack is just so strong. It's ridiculous. And then its special is really good if you're in a metagame where you're seeing Vader or Dooku. It's really undervalued. Most people just want that damage. And then it has 2 shields. Like, there's not a lot of 2-cost cards in the game that give you 2 shields on the side. Jetpack is just one of these cards that everyone's going to want 2 of. If you don't have 2 of them, be prepared to pay a premium for them. They're really, really good. So what's really interesting about the rares is they're all good. There's only a couple that I think are just not worth your time. But we're already at rares that are going to be substantially cheaper because they're more situational, but they're just really, really good. Scout is maybe the best red rare outside of characters, of course, as this list doesn't look at characters. But it's really strong. You have this ability to look into their hand, free information, pulling a card out. Now they have less rerolls. It has a focus side on it. It's a really good card for only 1 cost. On the hunt, maybe is going to end up higher on this list. It really depends on shields and how prevalent they are in the metagame. This is kind of the most powerful control card in the game because it is repeatable for 1. For 1, every single turn, you can remove your opponent's best die and then also take their shields away from that character. That is a totally disgusting card. The problem, of course, is it would cost you 1 to do that every turn. And so the sort of the mitigating factor of this card is it's unlikely that every single turn you're going to have 1 resource that you're willing to throw away to this card. But when you need to, it's really strong. It's a yellow upgrade. It's very powerful. Cunning to me is just so good. Like, it's so good. What holds it back is if you're running a deck like a Han Ray deck that has very few specials in it, now you're relying on your opponent. If your opponent also isn't playing specials, then you get in this really weird spot where it's not good. So Cunning becomes this card that is really great in the decks that are built to use Cunning, but it doesn't go in all decks. And so because of that, I think all of these cards are very good at what they do, but they're not going to be incredibly valuable. They're just really strong cards. Alright, in the next tier here, we just have a pile of really good cards. I think a lot of you will probably look at my inclusion of Immobilize here and tell me I'm totally out of my mind. And I would have agreed with you before. I used to think Immobilize was a top 5 rare, and now I think it's just solid. Its ability to remove a whole die from the board that cost you 2 to turn a die to a blank is really not as strong as it seems. I mean, sure, it's a great temporary mitigation, but all they have to do is re-roll their dice and hit an awesome side again, focus a die, and turn it to that great side. It just ends up being this very, very soft control, and it's a little bit too soft to me. It has shields, which is nice, but even the shield size, it's a 1, a 1, a 2. If it was like 1 more of them that had a 2, I would bump it up a little bit. The other thing, it has no value because it's in the starter set. The same holds for First Order TIE Fighter. First Order TIE Fighter is in this really weird spot where it costs a little bit more than you're usually comfortable paying for it. 3 cost means a lot. It's a turn and a half of resources. And its sides are a little bit underwhelming at 1 and 2. It has that third side for 3, but then it costs another. Then it's 4 to be able to do this and resolve it. And so I often find myself when I'm building decks going, I'll test it with 1 TIE Fighter. That seems reasonable. And then cut the TIE Fighter. I will say, though, that if shield metas become huge, like if everyone's running Qui-Gon, its value goes up quite a bit, as if you roll that special, you just, bam, knock it out. So 2 other cards that are sort of similar in this are the DH-17 Blaster Pistol. This is actually one of my favorite cards in the game. I think people are really undervaluing it. I think a lot of people will put this a lot lower on the tier list, but I think it's really strong. At only 1 cost is the key. If it was 2 cost, it wouldn't be half as good. But at 1 cost, you get 3 damage sides. I don't care that it has 2 blanks, to be honest. A lot of these cards, if you give me more damage sides and a cheaper cost point, sure, I'll throw in the shield and make it a blank. That's fine. I just want the damage. And so this, as a pure damage card, especially being red to be able to use with, like, it's a trap and other cards like that, becomes really, really strong. I think this is a fantastic card for only 1. The only reason it's not higher on the list is just it's not quite as powerful as those cards, but I think it's really strong. It's worth like nothing. It's a great card to just pick up for a very low price. Promotion is another just really solid, useful card. You play it, you get to draw a card. It only costs 1. It has some pretty decent sides. The problem is it really only fits great in a deck that either wants to draw more cards, just wants more dice, mill decks with patience, looking your way, or just wants a little bit extra damage that is in the plus form. You know, the modifiers are a little bit rough. You need to have a deck that's rolling regular sides frequently, otherwise they become dead sides. But at 1, it's really good. What holds it back is it's red character only, right? So you really need to be running a deck Like, you can't just splash in Stormtroopers into a deck and have that be your only red and be like, yeah, I'll just promote them to Elite Stormtroopers. The problem with that is they're going to die, and then it's like you spent one for a die that doesn't last very long. But if you can put it on Phasma or, you know, an Akbar in another deck, it can be really, really strong. And then Jedi Robes is a very solid card in a lot of decks. A lot of Jedi or blue decks are going to want Jedi Robes. Being able to mulligan 4 Jedi Robes, you play it on turn 1 for 2, you get your 2 shields, and then you just overwrite it next turn. Yeah, I agree. It's not that great once it's on the board, but you overwrite it. It's fine. And then it was free, basically. Free 2 shields for an extra action. So it can be a really solid card. I can see it going up or down, sort of depending on, you know, other factors, what the metagame looks like. But it can be really strong. And in mono blue, where you have stuff like It Binds All Things, you just want more and more blue upgrades, and it's a very solid upgrade. All right, so this next group, that's actually all good cards. Like, they're all good. It's just they're more situational and they're more expensive. So, for instance, something like Flamethrower, it's probably the sexiest card in the game. There's a 4 melee on it. And if you could 4-strike this card, I would move it way up. But you can't. So you have to roll the 1 in 6 to get the 4. Have to have another resource after you've already paid 3 for this. So it's basically 4 costs to do that 4 damage. It just is a little bit too expensive. At 2, the card would probably be busted. But at 3, I feel like I often put this card in, and I'm like, yes, this is the deck for Flamethrower. And I inevitably cut it. It never quite sticks around long enough because it doesn't have impact often enough. But it is a great card. DL44 Heavy Blaster Pistol is a very high tier in the Han Rey deck. The problem is, outside of the Han Rey deck, I tend to look at it and go, it's hero only, so there's not a lot of decks it can go in outside of the Han Rey deck. It's really expensive at 3. If you're not using the ambush, like getting great value out of it, like sticking it on Rey and then getting a shield for Han, it loses value. So it probably would be safe to move it up a tier just because the Han Rey deck is so prevalent. But just in a vacuum in its own, having the 2 blanks is not the end of the world. Like we already talked about the D11 blaster or whatever it was, the DH14. I don't know what it's called. But it only cost 1. That's a huge difference to jump from 1 to 3. Another great example of this is the IQ A11 blaster rifle. I talked to a lot of people who love this gun. They think it's great. And I always say, for 2, it's awesome. For 3, I don't know. Like, I don't love it. It's fine, but it should be 2. But it can't be 2. It'd be too good. So for me at 3, it's just a little bit too costly. Remember, in this game, 3 resources is a turn and a half of generation. That's just a little bit too much for most decks for me. Even if I want guns, there's usually enough other ones I can use that I don't have to play this. Force Protection also fits into this type of scenario where in the right deck it feels like it'll be really good. I can't find that deck. Every deck I want to put it into, I'm like, yeah, this is the deck. Oh man, I'm going to get 3 shields. And then I roll it and I'm like, okay, I rolled the discard side. That's cool, I guess. I rolled the disrupt side. Okay, that's neat. Oh, I got 3 shields at the turn. That's cool. And it cost me 3. That's a ton. It has very low impact for 3. If it had even 1 decent damage side on it, I'd be like, okay, all right, now we're talking. When you miss the shields, you get a lot of damage. It really makes up for it. Maybe you can re-roll for the damage if you need it. It's just really hard for a card to have 0 damage sides to be worth 3 or more. To me, that's a very tough cost point to be if you don't have damage. Speeder Bike Scout. Boy, this card is 1 damage side away from being really good. It's basically a TIE fighter that's missing a damage side and trading the ability to pull shields for removing dice. Now, that sounds awesome to remove a die every turn, but you have to remove the Speeder Bike Scout's die, so you're paying 3 to remove 1 of their dice repeatedly if you roll the special. So I've tried it several times, and I don't know. I don't love it. With Cunning, it's a little bit better because now Cunning always has this option to remove a die. But I feel like it's 1 damage side away from being very much worth a 3. Right now, I don't know. I have a hard time sliding that into decks. Last card in this tier is Force Training. Now, Force Training is a card that's really grown on me as of late. And it may actually be a higher tier. I put it in here because it seems like much like the DL44 Heavy Blaster Pistol, which is great in certain decks, just randomly throwing Force Training in decks is not something I'm looking to do. If I have a deck that is blue and needs melee, because there's so few melee weapons, I tend to gravitate towards Force Training. But I think that's going to change dramatically in the future as we get more decent melee weapons. I think we're going to look at Force Training and go, well, it only has the one side. Its ability is not that great, and it costs 2. Like, this almost feels like a card that should cost 1, and then make it like a +1 melee instead of +2. So I don't know. It feels a little overcosted to me. But if you're playing it for the melee side, just to have another melee side, maybe you're playing with It Binds All Things or Holocron, it becomes a lot more doable, I think. Even at 2, I think it's reasonable. So we move now to the bottom tier, and this is what's so impressive about Destiny. The bottom tier is pretty dang good. I almost would put Infantry Grenades in its own tier, because it's the only rare in the whole set where I look at it and go, yeah, no, I'm not playing that. Like, there's no deck I can conceive of where I'm playing Infantry Grenades. I just, like, maybe you do this crazy thermal detonator infantry grenades and just blowing up all the things all the time. I don't think so, though. It only has the one special. I just don't think it's worth it for its size. At 1, it would be a really good card. It'd be too good. The rest of these, though, they're good cards. These are not bad cards. They're just either too expensive or not impactful enough. A great example of this is Survival Gear. I like this card a lot, but it just feels like it's a little bit off somewhere. I can't quite put my finger on it. Like, it has no blanks. That's really good. 2 resource sides? That's crazy. It's a 2 shield side? My goodness. I've actually played this in several decks and been like, I think Survival Gear is going to be good in this deck. And every time I come away going, you know, it's just not good enough for 2. Like, it just doesn't do enough. If that melee side was a 2, or it had a 1 and 2, or if the focus was a 2, it would be worth the 2 cost. But I just feel like it's not quite worth it. Another great example of not worth its cost is Diplomatic Immunity. This card's great. Like, you just look at its dice size and you're like, dang, this card is awesome. Problem, of course, is it has no damage sides and it costs 4. That's 2 turns. That is 2 turns of generation, or like a turn and then using a bunch of dice to get resources to get Diplomatic Immunity. So my issue with the card is, if you're going to play this card, boy, you better get value out of it, right? First of all, it's an upgrade. So if that character dies, that 4 you spent is gone. And really what it's giving you is shields. Maybe you get lucky and you hit that 2 focus side and you have your dice set up just so that you're able to use that and really be able to work with it. But the problem is, while somebody like Akbar, you can build around his 2 focus side, you just can't do that with Diplomatic Immunity because you can't be guaranteed you're going to get it. And it costs 4. Even if you do draw it, you can't be guaranteed you're going to be able to play it. So you're really playing in a deck to leverage those shields. And I think in that deck, a deck that generates resources and uses shields, it can have a really good, valuable role. But I think that is a very small amount of decks. I've tried this in several other decks just as like, I could use shields in this deck. And every time I draw it, I'm like, oh my God, this thing costs 4? Are they out of their minds? This can't cost 4. So that's Diplomatic Immunity. Black Market is another card that's very similar. It's a good card. 2 focus is always great. Any card that's 2 focus, I'm immediately looking at it really carefully. Ooh, I kind of like this. Has 2 shields. That's great. A resource. A cool special. Get to draw more cards and increasing their cost. And it even has a damage side. So there's been many decks where I've tried Black Market and I always come away with the same thought. 3's too much. Like, okay, I'm taking my whole turn plus the one I had left over from last turn. Now I can't play Mitigation to play this card, and then I rolled the resource. Okay. Okay, cool. I rolled the special. I'm going to draw 2 cards, and I mean, there's not really that impactful this turn. I'm going to be, you know, getting down to 5 or less than 5 anyway, so I can draw back up. It's just, again, I think there's going to be a deck that uses it very well, especially some sort of combo deck that really wants to draw specific cards. I think it'll play probably 2 copies of Black Market. So it's not a bad card. It just doesn't feel like it fits in very many decks, and it feels like it's forced in when I put it in. Gaffy Stick. Oh, I've tried to like Gaffy Stick. Gaffy Stick is rough. It's so rough. It only has one non-dependent on other dice sides, and that side costs one. Oh my goodness. Like, it's really powerful, that special. But in order to do that, you're basically having to use Gaffy Stick and another melee die. So it's best with, like, a Dooku on a 1 melee side. That's like the dream. You turn it into a 3. But otherwise, you have to have another side out there for the +2 or the special. It just, to me, doesn't do quite enough. Like, if this thing cost 1, it would be worth playing, especially with that redeploy. The redeploy, I think, is what makes it valuable. But I just feel like the card pool is not ready for Gaffy Stick yet. I have a feeling that with another set, there may be a Gaffy Stick deck that becomes really good. Being able to do like Gaffy Stick, lightsaber, maybe there'll be another melee weapon with redeploy, and now you have this critical mass of redeploy melee weapons, and you just go like 4 characters wide and just stick all these crazy melee weapons on them. That could be really crazy and really powerful. But right now, I feel like every time I put Gaffy Stick in a deck, anytime I draw it early, I'm like, oh god, that is the worst draw ever. And then when I draw it late game, I'm like, it's not really that good now either. And anytime you have a card that's not good early and not good late, what's the value of that card again? Yeah, time to cut that card. Alright, Comlink. Oh, Comlink. We have had a complicated relationship. There was a time when I thought Comlink was one of the best cards in the game. Now admittedly, there weren't many cards in the game, so it was. And its ability is really good. You reroll any number of your dice, or any number of an opponent's dice by bringing this into play. So it's super flexible. The problem is it costs 2 and has very unimpactful sides. If one of these was a 2, like if it was a 2 focus or a 2 resource or a 2 shield, 2 would be great for it. And you may be saying, well, look at this ability you get. It's insane. It's not though. Like any ability that says, all right, I'm re-rolling all my opponent's dice, your turn. Or even any number of them. I re-roll 2 of your dice, your turn. That's terrifying. You re-roll your opponent's 2 Grievous dice that were on the 2 side, and they hit the 3 sides, and you're like, well, that didn't work out. That happens, right? It's a very RNG heavy card. I do like it to some degree in Han Rey, because you can control that. You get another action, because you play it on Rey. She takes an action after you play the Comlink. But if Comlink was 1, I would play it. Like, it would be worth it at that point. At 2, I just don't like the Comlink anymore. I just can't get behind that card. Outpost is also in a similar spot where it costs 2 for a die that doesn't do damage. So it needs to be really good. So where I think this card is going to really settle in is a Disrupt deck. The problem right now with Disrupt decks is they're less impactful than you want, because even if you go first and you roll the 2 discard and you're like, yep, nailed it. Your opponent just goes, oh, that's really unfortunate. You forced my hand. I now have to play this upgrade that I was considering playing later after I could kind of feel out the turn. Which is good. I mean, you forced your opponent's hand. But paying your whole turn, essentially, to do that just doesn't seem worth it. Now, I'm sure there's decks, and I'm sure down the road there'll be decks, where resolving the battlefield ability again, or a second time, or out of nowhere, is going to be incredibly powerful. And so its special alone will drive it up the tier list. But right now, I just feel like it's a card that is waiting. It's waiting for a great Disrupt deck to emerge. Something like Tactical Mastery, roll Outpost, resolve the 2 Disrupt before your opponent can even get going. And in fact, spoiler, Secret Time, I'm working on this deck so far. To little avail thus far, but we'll see if it makes it there. Last card in this bottom tier is Infiltrate. But to be honest, it's not a bad card. Like, this is another one of those cards that, because it has no damage sides, it just has a little impact. Now, if you hit that special, again, it's much like Comlink. It's worrisome. Like, you're just sitting there and you're like, yeah, I got this special sitting here. Go ahead, roll your dice. Let's see what happens. The problem is, what happens is if they roll a good dice and you just re-roll their dice and say your turn, it can have a very minimal effect. It can have a great effect, but it could have a minimal effect. And so, like, Force Throw, though costing 2 more, is substantially better. When you have the Force Throw special sitting there, your opponent doesn't even want to roll their dice. With Infiltrate, they're kind of like, well, whatever. We'll see what happens. I'll always be able to re-roll if they re-roll me poorly, or maybe I'll just smack them down if they re-roll me the good dice. And then the rest of the sides are just too low impact. Now, having said all that, I'm still willing to run it. As a 1-cost card in a mill deck with Patience, it definitely serves a role. But even in that deck, I think I've cut it down to 1. It's just very unimpactful. For me, it's dropped way down on the tier list. I originally had it substantially higher because that special sounds so good. And the more times I've played with that, I've been kind of like, well, it's just not, like, it can be good, but it can be pretty bad. Alright, well that is my rare tier list without the characters. I'm going to have a separate video that just has the characters in them. I hope you enjoyed the video. And remember, if you do want to support the channel, you can always go over to brokenegggames.com. Go ahead and make your purchases there. When you go to checkout, under the discount code, type in TG Games. And you can support the channel, support Broken Egg Games as well. And I'll see you next time on Tiny Grimes Games.